Been a few years back now that the Washington Post carried this headline: Massachusetts man hosts a free Thanksgiving dinner for all who RSVP. The article went on to say, for his first Thanksgiving alone in 1985, Scott McCauley was thinking that he would have to heat up a frozen turkey dinner and turn on a football game to stifle the silence in his apartment. With his parents recently divorced and nobody talking to anybody, he said, I was looking at a pretty rotten Thanksgiving, and I absolutely hate to eat alone. And then McCauley had an idea. What if he took out an ad in his hometown paper, the Melrose Free Press, and invited 12 strangers to join him for Thanksgiving dinner? It seemed like a manageable number to host at the First Baptist church he attended, and yeah, it was a little crazy, but it had to be better than being alone. I knew that I couldn't be the only one in this situation, he said. There had to be at least a dozen people out there who didn't want to spend Thanksgiving Day alone. Actually, it turns out far more than a dozen. And since those 12 strangers gathered around his table for turkey, stuffing, and pumpkin pie 37 years ago, McCauley has made his free feast an annual event. Through the years, he's fed plenty of widows, widowers, homeless people, college kids who couldn't make it home, even the guests who crawled under the table a few years ago. All are welcome. Jeff Shanklin, age 65, who lives alone and has attended every dinner, says he watches in admiration each year when McCauley makes a dinner happen. He prepares it all and we bring ourselves, Shanklin said. He really enjoys passing it on to lonely people in Melrose. For people like me with nowhere else to go, Scott is family. Now there's an event that fits that classic description of guess who's coming to dinner. You have a Bible handy today? Let's head in the direction of Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 7. That's where we're going to drop anchor this morning. Matthew, Mark, Luke, third book into the New Testament, third Gospel. If you get to John, Acts, Romans, you've gone too far. Come back the other direction. We make outlines available as you're entering the building in case you want to take notes. Feel free to take advantage of that. You can fill in some of the blanks, write down additional references. It's just a good way to track with me as we move down through the passage. Certainly wasn't Thanksgiving, and Simon the Pharisee didn't run an ad in the paper, but he did invite Jesus over for dinner. And there was a guest that surprised everyone. A nameless woman with a questionable past. And what's interesting is she never utters a single word through the entire passage. Never speaks a single word. And yet her actions speak volumes about the appropriate manner of expressing our thanksgiving to God. Let's begin with a little bit of backdrop here this morning. If you have the text open, we're going to pick it up at verse 36. Now, one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, and so he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. That sounds innocent enough, but as you study the text, you begin to question the Pharisee's motives. You see, a visiting teacher like Jesus should have been the guest of honor. And yet what makes this account so peculiar is that Christ has shown none of the standard rules of etiquette that would have been typical for that day. For example, it would have been customary for the host to extend a greeting, like a kiss on the cheek as a symbol of peace. It was also a common practice to either wash the feet of your guests, or at the very least, provide them with a basin of water so that they could do it themselves, since trudging around in the dust and dirt of first century Israel in sandals could give a person a serious case of toe jam. Finally, it was also standard procedure to refresh the head of your guest with some type of fragrant oil. Be like us splashing on a little cologne or aftershave today. But here's the point. At the home of Simon the Pharisee, none of this has happened. Jesus is being snubbed by his host. He's not received even the most basic acts of hospitality. It It would be like you inviting somebody over for dinner and then not greeting them at the door, not shaking their hand, texting on your phone while you ate, and then turning the TV up real loud after dinner so that you wouldn't have to visit with them. None of us would ever dream of being so rude. And yet Simon the Pharisee was. And so this serious breach of etiquette was like an elephant in the room, i.e., all the dinner guests were painfully aware of the way that Simon was treating Jesus. What can we conclude from this account today? Well, I think there's at least 3 lessons, 3 takeaways, and that's the direction that we'll head right now. The first one being this. Lesson number 1, we learn from this passage that brokenness should be the response when confronted with our sin. Brokenness is the appropriate response when confronted with our sinfulness. Into this setting, thick with tension, walks an uninvited woman of questionable character. You can see it there. The text tells us that she lived a sinful life. Most scholars interpret that to say that more than likely she was a prostitute. Now keep in mind that the homes of wealthy people usually had courtyards in which they would host large groups for dining. And as a result, it was not uncommon for outsiders to hover around banquets just to watch the important people and listen in on their conversations. Since everything was out in the open, they could even enter the dining area and speak to a guest, which is exactly what transpires here in verse 37. The Greek here literally reads, "And look, a woman." It was someone that most of the guests would have recognized. Her reputation preceded her. Her mere presence undoubtedly created a stir. Whether she actually heard the words or not, I'm sure she sensed the sentiments of others. What in the world does she think she's doing here? We can't say for sure, but I believe it's quite likely that this woman had crossed paths with Jesus earlier. I'm guessing she probably had heard him teach, maybe more than once. I even think it's safe to surmise that something Christ had said struck a responsive chord. His words that God loved her and that she could be forgiven of her past despite all that she had done undoubtedly resonated in her soul. In fact, they touched her so deeply that she was determined to seek him out, all of which explains her bold actions here. Because not only does she walk into the banquet in plain sight of all the influential guests, a banquet where she never would have been invited, but now she openly displays her gratitude. Remember, it would have been customary in those days to recline while eating. In other words, dinner guests would be on couches. They're probably propping themselves up on one elbow and using another to reach for the food. And so their feet actually would be stretching out behind them. And thus, the woman here could have easily approached Jesus' feet without ever coming near the table. She had come to honor Jesus. She had come to express her devotion. But as she gets close, all her plans go suddenly out of the window, and she completely loses it. She comes unhinged. So much so that her tears begin to mingle with the dust and dirt on Jesus' feet. She didn't try to stop herself from sobbing. In fact, the fact is, she couldn't. And why was she crying? Well, I believe it's because she was finally able to do for Jesus what she knew for some time that she wanted to do. And that was to make it perfectly clear that she was amazed by his love and overwhelmed by his kindness. She, of course, had not planned on falling apart. She had brought no towel to dry his feet. And so although a woman of that era would have never taken down her hair in public for fear of being labeled promiscuous, she not only does so, but then proceeds to dry his feet with her hair. And it doesn't stop there, does it? Overwhelmed by her feelings and oblivious to the opinions of those around her, she now begins to repeatedly kiss the feet of the one who had shown her the extent of God's grace. Finally, she takes an alabaster jar of perfume, breaks the neck of the container, so that she could spill the entire, very expensive contents all over the feet of the man who has forever changed her life. It is an incredibly moving scene of pure devotion, is it not? Lesson number 1, brokenness. Brokenness is the appropriate response when we come face to face with the depth of our depravity. Lesson number 2, arrogance. Arrogance is the attitude that will actually blind us to our need. The contrast with that which is recorded next could not be more vivid. Look what it says. When the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Simon the Pharisee is quick to judge, and his critical attitude swiftly surfaces. He uses the word touching there. It's terminology that carries implications of sexual advances. And so Simon's conclusion at this point is Jesus must be a second-rate prophet if he unknowingly associates with low life like this. That's the danger behind arrogance. It blinds us to the truth. Here was God under his roof, and yet Simon's heart is so crusty with pride that he completely misses it, doesn't he? Watch now how Jesus makes it clear that not only does he know what kind of woman she is, but he also knows what kind of man Simon is. We'll pick it up in verse 40, where Jesus says, Simon, I have something to tell you. Fascinating. You say, Gary, what's so fascinating about that? Well, stop and think about it. The Pharisee hasn't said anything yet, has he? But Jesus already knows his secret thoughts. And you can almost sense Simon's smugness as he replies, tell me, teacher, which Jesus now proceeds to do. He tells him a tale about two guys who were in deep weeds financially. They owed money to a moneylender. And that's the only time that particular Greek word is used in the entire New Testament. You'll only find it here. And the background on the word is that of a shady character who collected interest on his loans. In other words, to be in debt to someone like this was a definite no-no. It indicated questionable activity. If we were to share this saga in contemporary terms, we might put it like this. Now, two bookies were in over their heads to a mafia boss named Vito. That's the picture here. Both men owed money. The only difference between them is the size of the debt. One man owed 50 denarii, the other guy 500. Now, the smaller debt carried the illusion of manageability, whereas the larger debt guy knew he was in desperate straits. But in reality, they were both in trouble because neither one of them had the resources to pay their debt. And if you can't pay, you can't. It doesn't matter what the size of the debt. If you can't pay, you can't pay. And yet, amazingly enough, Vito, the loan shark, calls him into his office and says, listen, instead of breaking your legs and giving you a cement overcoat, I'm going to wipe your slate clean and let you boys off the hook. All of which led Jesus to this conclusion. Simon, I hope you've been paying attention. Which of these two men is going to be filled with the most relief and gratitude? Little debt guy or big debt guy? Simon wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, but he could do simple math. And so he responded, probably somewhat reluctantly, well, I suppose the big debt guy. To which Jesus replies, you got it. You have judged correctly. It's a no-brainer, isn't it? Simon just needed help seeing it here. His arrogance had blinded him to how great of a debt he really owed. Lesson number 1, brokenness should be the response when confronted with our sin. Lesson 2, arrogance is the attitude that blinds us to our need. Finally, lesson number 3, extravagance Extravagance is the expression that reveals a grateful heart. I love what comes next. Up to this point in the conversation, Jesus has been looking at Simon. But now in verse 44, all that changes. Christ turns towards the woman, but he continues his conversation with Simon. He says, Simon, do you see this woman? Simon had seen her, but only for what she was, not for who she was or who she could be. He had looked at her form, but not her heart. He judged her actions without considering her attitude. And so Jesus says, Simon, I want you to see her. He employs him. I want you to see her for who she really is. And then he continues, I came into your house, Simon, but you did not give me any water for my feet. But she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she loved much. But he who has been forgiven little loves little. And then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. Now the NIV here is a tad misleading. Jesus is not saying that the woman's sins were forgiven because she loved much. That's not the point. Holman Christian Standard Bible actually translates it maybe a little bit more accurately. It should be like this. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven. And that's why she loved much. But the one who's forgiven little loves little. And what was the basis for her forgiveness? Make sure you don't miss it. Verse 48, Jesus now says to the woman, your sins are forgiven. And then he follows that up in verse 50 by saying, your faith, right? Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. That's a critical detail today. It's important that we understand it was her faith that saved her. Her response to Jesus' earlier message, and her actions here were the evidence of how grateful she was for the forgiveness she had received. Does that make sense? Radical, extravagant gratitude was her response to God's amazing grace. Let's just put ourselves in her sandals for just a second and try to imagine the relief that this woman must have felt on hearing those words. She had all but given up. She had no doubt assumed that forgiveness was possible for everyone else but her. Her life, so infected with the effects of sin, seemed completely hopeless, and then she met Jesus. It's possible that you're here today and you're feeling the same way. Maybe you need to hear that it's not too late. Maybe you need to be reminded that we serve a God of mercy and forgiveness. Maybe you need to hear that just as Jesus welcomed this woman and gave her another chance, he can do the same for you. But this message is not just for those who've encountered Christ but this message is not just for those who haven't encountered Christ yet. In fact, it may be even more so for those who have walked with him for a lengthy period of time. You see, normally this account would be applied with an either-or ending, right? In other words, the question typically runs something like this. Are you more like Simon or more like the woman? Are you a critical, judgmental Pharisee or are you a humble, broken sinner? But instead of doing the either-or thing today, I wonder if we could look at this text with a both-and perspective. So here's my question. Is it possible that you started out like the woman, but then over time you've become more and more like Simon? Did you start out like the woman? In other words, when you started your walk with God and you began your relationship with Jesus, did you show the same kind of devotion and gratitude that this woman demonstrated? Is that where you started? With this woman at Jesus' feet, overwhelmed by his grace and mercy? Did you start out like the woman, and then somewhere along the way, your heart became crusty? Somewhere along the way, you started taking God's grace for granted. You lost sight of the debt you owed, and you forgot about the forgiveness you received. This is the season of Thanksgiving. And we can quickly enumerate all our blessings, and well, we should. Our health, our home, our family and friends, the roof over our heads, the clothes on our back, the food on our table. We should acknowledge all those things. They're blessings from above. Repeatedly in the Scriptures, we're exhorted to give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. And so we need to be thankful for the blessings that God pours out into our lives. But I wonder, gang, I can't help but wonder, if all those things were taken from us, would we still be a thankful people? Because here's the reality. Even if all those things were eliminated, we would still have all we need in Christ. I like the way A.W. Tozer said it. He said, the sovereign God wants to be loved for himself and honored for himself, but that is only part of what he wants. The other part is that he wants us to know that when we have him, we have everything. We have all the rest. It's a gift that calls for extravagant gratitude. The Oxford English Dictionary describes extravagant as wasteful. Isn't that interesting? This woman who had wasted her entire life doing the most degrading things that you could ever imagine doesn't think twice about emptying the contents of her costly perfume on the feet of Jesus. And my hunch is, if she had more, she probably would have given more. She not only broke her jar, she shattered the mold of how worship should be done. Passionately, personally, with reckless abandonment, not caring about what anybody else is thinking. That alabaster jar of perfume could have looked something like this. You see, it's quite probable that the woman here, like most prostitutes of her day, wore that alabaster jar around her neck. That was quite typical. To wear a necklace with a small flask of perfume. It was cosmetic. It would have been part of her allure. Are you tracking with me? That flask was her identity. It was part of her job. It was a tool of her trade. And more than likely, it was the most valuable thing that she owned. For her to take off her flask and pour it at Jesus' feet, she was essentially saying, I now have a better use for this perfume. She was changing the direction of her life. When she took that flask off her neck and poured the contents at Jesus' feet, she was saying, you are now the most important thing in my life. You're not just one more thing that I'll try to squeeze into my schedule. No, you're priority number one. You're the most valuable. You're my Lord. And you know what? Bottom line today, that's what God would desire for all of us who know him. He wants to be the master of everything in your life. Your goals, your job, your sexuality, your thought life, your ethics, your money, your behavior, your relationships. He wants to be the master of everything. You see, gang, here's the reality. We all have little flasks around our neck. We all have those things that are most important to us. And you're going to pour them out at somebody's feet. There's something and someone that you're going to live for. There's something and someone who gets your heart. The question is, who do you live for utterly and entirely? Will you live your life in radical gratitude to Jesus? Because those who are forgiven most love most. I ran across a video clip recently that portrayed that powerfully, and I thought it did such an excellent job of summarizing our point here today. I wanted to share it with you. So let's take a look at it.
I'm not what you'd call a patient person. I'm sure I have other strengths, but let's just say I'm working on that one.
Oh, I am so sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No,
No, I insist. But I've started to realize that when something happens that really
I am so sorry.
provokes my impatience, there's probably something there I should pay attention to.
What's the price on that?
$3.19.
Oh wait, I have a coupon for that one. I know it's in here. Hold on. Here you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was the price on that one?
$4.
Oh, you could take that one off. I don't need that one.
$1.45.
Oh my goodness. She's price checking a bar of soap. And that's when I realized she's price checking a bar of soap. She needs these things, and she doesn't have enough to pay for them. And then it hit me. I've been her. Anxious. Not over money, anxious over my soul. I've been scared because I know that I need so much more than I have, and I don't have near enough for what I need. I won't ever have enough, because none of us do. No matter what we do, no matter how many coupons we produce, no matter how we try to make up the difference, when we do the math, we all fall short. So thank God that his son came along and said, I'll pay for it.
No.
I'll pay for all of it.
I can't let you do that.
Please. I want to. Will you let me pay for all this?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, but I have coupons. I have coupons.
Hey. You can put away your coupons. You don't need them. It's all completely covered. All of it. All of it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That woman's predicament in the checkout line is the plight that each one of us faces. Each and every one of us has a need that's far bigger than what we have the means to cover. Each and every one of us has a cost, a debt that we can't even begin to pay. No matter what we do, no matter how many coupons we produce, no matter how hard we try to make up the difference, when we do the math, we all come up short. Thankfully, God sent his son. Jesus came along and said, I'll pay for it. I'll pay for it. Keep your coupons. It's completely covered. All of it. That kind of grace is worthy of radical, extravagant gratitude. How did the hymn writer express it? Take my life, Lord. Take my love, my Lord, I pour at thy feet its treasure store. take myself, and I will be ever only all for thee. Does that express the sentiments of your heart today? I trust that it does. We're going to sing an updated, more contemporary version of that hymn, but essentially the same thoughts, the same sentiments. Let's express it before Jesus from a heart of gratitude today. Get on our feet as we worship.